Thank you, Julia. Welcome, everybody, to the next installment of our EPPAC working group. It's good to see everybody. We're going to be using this working group meeting today as kind of a cleanup working group installment because we've had a lot of different topics covered over the last 2 or 3 meetings with the headroom and the scenarios 2 and 3, plus the DER and D for modeling information. And so we wanted to address like a number of the questions that have come in from EPPAC members over the last few weeks, all in one meeting. We've gone through most of the results, most of the final assumptions for scenario 2 and 3, as well as the state scenario, and I've also given one presentation on the headroom analysis and how that works its way into the capacity expansion model. But there are still a bunch of open questions, and fortunately we actually have a meeting right now where we can kind of go over all of those things and answer everybody's questions before we start getting any preliminary or final results from any of the scenarios, just in case any tweaks are needed. So I think this is kind of good timing to be able to go through some of those questions. So we have a list compiled that have come in through the different channels that we've been collecting questions, the EPPAC email, my email address, or to JU. And so we've kind of compiled those so we can go through them today. So everybody has the benefit of seeing those, the responses to those questions, and maybe even learns a little bit more about the individual scenarios and the headroom modeling. So it's going to be kind of a, a bounce around type meeting, because there's going to be some questions that folks from the NISO may be better positioned to answer, some that we could answer as DPS or NYSERDA, and some that the joint utilities might be able to answer. So it's going to be more of a popcorn style meeting, and hopefully that kind of kicks off some more discussion. And if it sparks more questions in folks' minds, please feel free to jump in and build on that discussion or ask any other questions, because that's what this meeting primarily is for, is to kind of wrap up those final questions around the scenarios and how those are going to be treated, and then following along with some of the headroom analysis. So before we jump in and start going through those questions kind of one by one, were there any other clarification questions or questions about the topic or timing or anything? Okay. And just before we get started, I also, it just popped in my head, I wanted to remind everybody that our regularly scheduled meeting time that would have been 2 weeks from now actually falls on President's Day holiday. And so we've already gone ahead and shifted that back 1 week to be on the having the next meeting on the 26th of February, just so folks keep that in mind on their calendar. So hopefully that still works for everybody, but we just went ahead and did that because we knew we wouldn't be on for that day. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump in and start walking through some of these questions. And please, if folks who ask the questions want to jump in and clarify or expand on their questions, please feel free. But I'm going to read the question and then try to do my best to figure out who can be best to answer that, or try to answer it myself. And we'll just go through that way. So the first question that came in was, is there a list of the base case generators that would fall into the base case of the capacity expansion model, and what were the inclusion rules to be considered firm generation? We in all 3 of the scenarios are using the NISO Gold Book existing generator list, which accounts for any noticed deactivations, such as from the DEC NOx rule, and then building in the contracted generators that have signed contracts from NYSERDA as well in the model, and those were obviously subject to the inclusion rules back from November. And so there has been, obviously a number of contract cancellations, but we have, I think, decided already not to update that list of included generation because of a number of reasons we've gone through on previous calls around how the magnitude of generation and the queue positions and the availability of future rounds of NYSERDA procurements. We decided to kind of leave that initial list intact, and just want to see if there's any other clarifications folks need on that. Okay, we can always come back to. There's a question about whether the DER, especially in that high DER scenario, will that be modeled explicitly or as a load modifier across the scenarios? And just noting that it's particularly important when there's a high DER volume in the scenario 2. So what we had discussed previously was that the solar generators that are distributed generation, and that's the primary form of DER we're going to be seeing in the model, that is built in through a solar generation profile that's the same as the transmission connected solar profile, but it's happening at the distribution network, and that's incorporated as a load modifier onto the load. Energy storage, though, will be incorporated into the model, is my understanding, where it will actually be able to be dispatched for that peak demand reduction. So it's not just going to be sitting there on a fixed schedule throughout the modeling time frame. We thought that was important because it actually gives storage the chance to kind of be flexible and a little bit more dynamic in the modeling and actually hit peaks when they happen. I see a hand, Chris.
Yeah, Skylar, just real quick, going back to your first point. So you're going to use the contracted plants as they were prior to the contracts being canceled, with the assumption that many of them may be revisited in the solicitations. But what happens if you do get, say a gigawatt or 2 gigawatts that just go away just because they may have not been good contracts, period?
Yes, no, that's a good point. The concept there is that we're not necessarily fixing the specific project itself. It's more about the megawatts of the type of resource. And so if, for example, a specific project in a specific zone, like a 100 megawatt solar project, has canceled in the meantime and may drop out entirely, forever for good, there is a good chance that a separate potentially 100 megawatt or more solar project could potentially come in there just because of the magnitude of build out we're likely going to see being, an order of magnitude larger than the firm build, that the kind of error bars there, the failures or the attrition is likely to be within the error bars there. And that's kind of the concept, not necessarily that we're banking on specific projects from specific contractors or developers staying alive or something like that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. The next piece of the modeling is something that we're actually still talking about right now. So it'd be helpful to maybe have a conversation with the JU and the NISO on. This question was about confirming how distribution investments may be accounted for in the model, especially once again in that low transmission scenario where there may be a doubling of the amount of distributed solar. And the note is just around whether the high DER integration could actually come with significant distribution costs, and wanting to make sure those are accounted for properly so that it can be compared to transmission investments for the large scale renewables. So this is interesting because there's a number of ways this could be accounted for, either as just a multiplier on the cost of the resulting modeling, or as a actual adder on the project itself in a given zone in the model explicitly. I don't think we've landed on that, but happy to have a quick conversation to see if maybe the NISO folks are on the line to see if they've had to deal with this before, because I know we have incorporated increasing numbers of distributed generation before. I'm just curious if they've ever incorporated a distribution cost to go along with those. Well, it doesn't look like we have Jason or Sarah today. Chi, do you know this, or should we just follow up with Sarah and Jason later?
Yeah, this is she. I'm sorry. I was thinking we would need to follow up later. I thought
Okay.
Sarah should be able to join shortly.
Okay, so if she hops on, we'll hold that question until that time, because that is obviously an important question. We want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples across the cases. If there are additional costs for distributed generation that might need to be accounted for, it's not necessarily going to be free to interconnect those as compared to large scale renewables. So that'll be important to take into account. I just saw Sarah jump on. Bill, did you have a clarification or a quick question there?
I have a quick question or more of a comment. I think you do want, I think it makes sense to explore how you do this, but I want to make sure we understand that it's also it can go both directions. It can go positive or negative in the sense that obviously, the distributed energy resources can add interconnection costs to the distribution system. They also can reduce distribution build out costs. I mean, obviously, that's the whole basis of the DRV and the VEDR. It's the whole basis of a lot of our work that we're actually you can reduce the distribution cost built out. It's going to happen especially with the very large load growth we're exhibiting. So I would be very careful that if we are going to include a extra cost, that we also look at including a benefit, because in many cases I suspect it could actually balance out to be exactly in the other direction.
Great point. Thank you, Bill. And Sarah, sorry to jump right at you as soon as you jump on, but we just had a question about whether we've ever been able to incorporate costs or benefits of distribution resource interconnections into the model. Just noting that adding solar and storage may cause distribution upgrade requirements. Just wondering if that's been incorporated into modeling ever at the NISO.
Thanks, Skylar, for repeating the question, and apologies for jumping on late here. So to date, we have never done that. In terms of distributed resources, our method has always been to include distributed resources as part of the load forecast. So we've done it through that, and they're not, a unique resource that has a cost associated with it. I hope that helps answer the question, but let me know if there's any follow-up on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this is something that's going to require a little bit more discussion, because as Bill mentioned, this cuts both ways. The storage on the distribution network and even solar to a certain extent can help reduce distribution peaks and help mitigate distribution upgrade costs. But simultaneously, there is the chance that that there's also additional upgrades required that could cost additional funds. So we want to make sure we're representing this accurately, and we may end up coming down on kind of where Bill was going, where there's a complicated pro and con list, and some of those in many areas kind of cancel out. And so it might end up being where we just don't put an additional cost or benefit, because it's going to be very complicated for the model, especially in a case where we are already hard coding in a certain amount of DERs. There's not much for the model to do. We'd basically be just forcing additional cost or benefit into the model. So we may end up coming down on not doing anything this time, but it's definitely something important to track, particularly when we get down to the final stage, 5 and 6, and start writing recommendations and how to interpret these scenarios. So we'll definitely have to keep that in mind, and we'll follow up later if we have any other information about that. There was a question also about clarifying the retirement rule used for the nuclear power plants in the state. Somebody from the NICE, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the policy so far has been that the existing nuclear plants stay online until 2039 and then are assumed to kind of be re-permitted throughout the life of the modeling time horizon that we're looking at. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
Awesome, thank you. Then there was a little bit more of a detailed question around the feasibility of utilizing such a high DER penetration. I think the information that was shared around at the last meeting was that switching to maybe utilizing the quote-unquote high DER penetration numbers from the DER solar roadmap of somewhere around 25, 26 gigawatts of distributed solar by 2050 seems like a pretty high number, especially when you build into the fact that it's already in kind of a low load scenario. We are matching right now behind the scenes, trying to match that load profile with those numbers, because the lower load profile that we have incorporates a lot of load modification by DERs already. So some portion of that 26 gigawatts is already built into that low load case. So it's not going to be a low load scenario that also drops by 26 gigawatts or something like that. So that will be taken into account in terms of our take on the feasibility of those numbers. We're already having plans submitted for 10, 11, 12 gigawatts within the next, 5 to 6 years. So I think if we're at 11 or 12 by 2030 or so, I don't think it's infeasible at all to assume that in the next 20 years we could get as much as we've gotten in the last 10 years. So I think that's something that I'm comfortable with having a number that high in the model, just because we are already trying to test a higher DER penetration in the model, and comfortable seeing how that works out. And then there was one more question in the modeling about the peak loads in the scenarios seeming low, even in the high load case. And there was a question if we had added all of the large loads into that. The initial Climate Action Council load profiles that we've been starting with as kind of the base cases for each of the scenarios, they did not incorporate the large loads because they were basically built out in 2021. And so we've been following a process where the NISO large load forecast from the Gold Book has been basically added to our existing load shapes from the Climate Action Council because they are incremental. And so the person who asked this question must have been very perceptive, because they did notice that the summer peak values seemed lower by a gigawatt or two. And that is because those large loads that have requested interconnection over the last year or two in the Gold Book, those were not incorporated yet, but they will be in the model. So that should be all taken care of. So that was the list of questions we had over the last 2 weeks from the scenarios 2 and 3. Was there any additional discussion folks wanted to have around the finalization of those scenarios? Any burning questions or thoughts about building out of those questions? I see, Chris, you have your hand up. Is that?
I had one other question, Scholar, back on the nuclear assumption.
Sure.
And is it 2029 or 2039 is considered the end of life for certain units, but then potentially extending into the future? Because the ZEC program actually goes out to, I think it was April of 29. And then a number of units are near end of license.
It's whatever those license years are. I might have misspoke. It's one of those two. Sarah, do you know the specific years?
Not offhand, I would have to check, but I think in short, just from a modeling perspective, what we're assuming is that when those licenses, whenever they're up for each unit, the assumption is that they would be extended and continue to operate.
Okay, and then are you assuming a 20-year extension, Sarah?
I think that's fair. Either way, it goes through the study period. The study period ends in 2042. So either way, they're, online through the remainder of the study period.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, just so folks are aware, over this next few days, the final data sets will be pulled together, and that final matrix will be cleaned up and sent over to the NISO as part of that process, and then we'll be posting all those final documents onto the EPPAC webpage for any additional review. There's going to be additional discussions on citing methodologies in the future and other things like preliminary results. But we're trying to wrap up these initial assumption sets so we can kick off that work as soon as possible, because we are kind of on in crunch time. This is going to be a very detailed modeling process, especially in stages 2 and 3, and we need to make sure we're staying on track for that. So I think now, if there's no other questions on the scenario development, we're going to switch to questions that have come in on the headroom analysis. This was a presentation that was given back in January, at the beginning of January, and there was a detailed discussion on it, but I think it was noted at that time that it was very important. There was some clarifications folks wanted to have afterwards, so we've been collecting that information, and now we wanted to kind of just walk through a couple of those questions to make sure everybody's comfortable with what's being done at the moment. There was a question about could the comprehensive file with the calculations of the headroom values be shared with EPPAC members at some point? Or maybe just a file including what existing or firm renewable generators were included in the analysis, calculating the headroom itself. Is anyone in the JU able to maybe discuss what format that information is in and what additional information might be able to be shared?
Skylar, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid. So what we did is each utility figured out the headroom in each zone, and then we added up all the headroom when there was multiple utilities in that zone. So that's how we arrived at the final numbers. So just as a reminder, we did, as part of the headroom calculations, there is information out there posted. So any project that is in service was included in the headroom test. Any project that has completed the interconnection process and has met the base case inclusion rules, those were assumed to be in the base cases for the headroom test. And then we performed the headroom test on top of that. So we did not add any additional generators. We did not add contracted resources. We did not add, projects that were in the interconnection queue but have not completed the interconnection process. So really, it's just generators that have completed the class year and met the base case inclusion rules is really all that was in the base case that we studied. So headroom is on top of those generators.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think we did discuss in that meeting on, I think, January 8th. So, and there is the web posting of the recording if anybody needs to go back and watch that. That the NISO will be kind of trying to come together and make sure that's being accounted for. Any other generation that is considered in the modeling, in the capacity expansion modeling as a firm generation resource that is not in the headroom calculation will have to eat up some of that headroom analysis, just so there's not, quote unquote, free megawatts floating around everywhere. We don't try to be accurate there, so that hopefully it answers the question. And in terms of the data, Jeff, you said, along with those postings, I think it was last August, something like that. There is the data is out there, right? And I think we posted along with the EPPAC resources some kind of zonal headroom numbers.
Yeah, the filing was from August 1st. So in that August 1st filing, we list all of the generators that I think had not met. Well, I think we listed all the generators that were included in the pockets, and then we list the headroom in each pocket.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. The next question was a pretty detailed one. There was a question about whether the headroom analysis is accounting for headroom on the bulk transmission system or just the quote unquote sub-transmission or the local transmission system, and just wanting to clarify whether the utilities have a kind of unified approach or a unified definition of where you start and end that headroom modeling.
So we really don't include bulk headroom. Hopefully everyone recalls that the headroom methodology was something that was put out by the DPS. So we've been using that headroom methodology, and the objective there in that headroom methodology is to kind of define a pocket of the system and then determine the amount of headroom within that pocket. So sometimes those pockets can include higher voltage systems, but often they do not. Often they are like a lower voltage network, maybe below 200 kV. So that is where the headroom is defined, is on that local system.
Any follow-ups to that question? Oh, Radhika?
Thank you, Skylar. Maybe Jeff, a follow-up on your response. So if that bulk headroom is not included, shouldn't there be an additional piece for the to represent the intra-zone constraints?
So that is a pipe and bubble model, right? So there's only so much, even if there was zero consideration of headroom, there's still a ceiling to how much you could place inside that bubble before you hit the limit of the pipes, the ability to transfer that power out of that bubble. So that is somewhat of a proxy. I mean, in a perfect world, could we do something different with headroom? Maybe, but as of right now, we don't have a methodology for how to do that.
So it comes back to whether those intra-zone constraints are hit or not in the model. Because if they are hit in the model, then and there is like a delta between those intra-zone constraints and the pipe limit, then that could be the extra megawatts that could be allowed in that zone. No.
Without seeing without seeing the results, it's tough to say how limiting this headroom is going to be in the model. We really don't have a good feel for it. Some of the zonal headroom numbers are pretty substantial, so there's a chance that we may or may not hit these zonal headroom limits to begin with. If you hit that limit, could you make an argument that there maybe is more headroom to connect on the bulk system? That's a possibility. But again, as of now, we don't have any way to calculate that number for bulk headroom.
Maybe a follow-up question for New York ISO team. Will we be able to get some information whether those intra-zone constraints are hit in the model based on your preliminary results?
This is Sarah from the NASO. I think we can take that back. I don't think that's typically information that we have provided in the past. So let me take that back and see if we can provide any insights on that in addition to headroom. Thanks.
That would be helpful, Sarah. Thank you. Because I think many of us on the EPPAC group, we think that's a very critical piece of information. And if the intra-zone constraints are hit, then like just based on the examples and the discussion we had previously, you may not add more renewables in zone E, you move to another zone. In reality, you may have a lot more development in that other zone. So I personally think, and I think there are others on the EPPAC group who think that this information is critical to understand if those constraints are hit and how that may change the results of the capacity expansion in regards to adding renewables in each zone. I don't have any other comment, but I don't know. It would be great if, yeah, we can get some information on the constraints and some confirmation that we can have that discussion.
Skylar, do we move on? Did we lose him? Uh-oh. Hey, Skylar, you're muted. Oh boy.
I lost power. Oh my gosh, how embarrassing is that?
Wow.
And
Well, that proves it's not true that we have special arrangements with the utilities.
no, this unfortunately is a regular occurrence at my house, so I have to take care of that. So sorry about that. Hopefully there was a robust discussion while I was gone. Okay, so if we could jump back into the questions. I know there's another one here about how there's some trends that seem to be happening in some of the headroom values. They're not necessarily static over the entire modeling horizon. And so the headroom sometimes goes up over time or actually decreases significantly between now and 2040. And just wondering if there was some context that Jay you could provide around what the main drivers there are in a lot of those areas.
So this one is a very difficult one. Networks are complex. Like that's really the answer here. These are not radial systems. This is not hosting capacity, it's headroom. So headroom, the reason we had to do quite a bit of work to come up with this concept of how we would calculate headroom is that these networks are complex. I mean, as we move out to 2040, the load becomes very significant. It's rapidly growing through the 2030s. So by the time we hit 2040, we start to see a system that is stressed by the load. These pockets of our system are not just pure generation pockets. They do carry and support all of our load. So as the load is starting kind of to chew up available transmission capability, sometimes the direction of that load flow is the same direction that the generation wants to flow in. So what we see is a loss of headroom because of that load increase. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes load is in the right location, that it kind of soaks up the generation and creates additional capacity to export that generation from the local pocket to the rest of the system. It could go either way, but again, as we get to 2040 and we start to see kind of a lot of additional stress on the system, we do believe there's a downward trend in the headroom capability.
Any follow-ups on that? Because that makes a lot of sense. I know that the headroom is based on, the interaction between load and transmission capability. Those numbers are dynamic, so it makes sense. They would be changing over time.
Just a question, Bill Acker here. That was a great explanation, and it makes me think that the difference between considering headroom for a DER and considering headroom for a transmission connected unit is going to be very, very different when the load grows. Any thoughts on, I'm not even sure, are we applying the headroom limit on DERs as well as for larger scale just transmission connected systems? And if so, any thoughts on that?
I would say that I think the transmission system is agnostic to what kind of electrons it's pushing around. So if it's trying to deliver load, it's trying to deliver DER, it's trying to deliver generation, I don't really think it matters. The DER is a little bit more spread out, but in some of these areas where we're seeing a lot of renewable development, a lot of DER, a lot of large scale renewables, these tend to be like remote areas of the upstate system. In these remote areas, there's not a lot of transmission lines. So those transmission lines are asked to support everything. So if you have DER sitting at the end of a line where it's netting out the distribution load to the extent that it's pushing power back onto the transmission lines, or if you have LSR that's directly connected to the transmission line, it may not be any different. You may see the same result.
Yeah, I guess I can see that. I mean, I guess it points to the huge variability in the headroom effect that, you know, if the DER is where the load is, it's gonna actually increase the headroom. If it's not where the load is, it's gonna decrease it. So it does seem like this gets more complex as we go on. Thank you.
Definitely something to keep track of for sure. The next question is how storage gets incorporated in the headroom calculations. I believe where we landed was that storage is going to impact, you know, just by being in the model, it's going to impact the headroom numbers because it's kind of like an hourly energy deliverability headroom type calculation. But if somebody from the NICE wants to clarify that.
Hey everyone, this is Sarah again. So in regards to headroom, yeah, I think so since it's applicable to its total headroom for all resources in the area, I think it can be implemented either way if there's a recommendation one way or the other. So we can implement it just as recommended. So if storage should be one of those resources that counts towards headroom, then yes, absolutely. I think it would impact headroom. So I think that's just something that we need to clarify in terms of, you know, the exact resources that are assumed for headroom. But I hope that makes sense in terms of the implementation.
Maybe a few pieces I'll add here. You know, if we said that there was 400 megawatts of headroom, again, we're technology agnostic. So 400 megawatts of headroom means 400 megawatts of renewable generation could be coming out of that area. It could also mean that 400 megawatts of storage discharge is coming out of the area. So you know, think about like an overnight, there's no solar, there's no wind. You've got 500 megawatts worth of batteries that are trying to discharge and 400 megawatts of headroom. Well, that doesn't work. The headroom would limit the discharge of storage the same way it limits the output from other renewable generators. You know, so that's an important thing that we want to keep in mind, is that the system cannot support an unlimited amount of storage the same way it can't support an unlimited amount of renewables. Beyond that, you know, to the extent that storage is netting off kind of the renewable generation, we think that what we're going to do with this model is we're going to net them, right? So the net of storage and renewables within that pocket could be considered. We have a little bit of work to do to make sure that this is going to work correctly, because obviously renewable generator that's, again, think about upstate New York, is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. And then think of a storage unit that is kind of closer to the bulk system near a major interface, directly connected to that bulk system. Like, they're not really going to net against each other. It's really storage close to the generation would effectively net with each other. So as long as we think we can get that to work, that's kind of where we're envisioning going with the treatment of storage and renewables against headroom.
Yeah, I think that last part was a really good clarification, because I think one of the things that came up on our last presentation of this was the potential binding nature of the quote unquote low load season in New York. And if there's, you know, deliveries on like a, you know, March or April morning, storage could potentially charge there, and the model might want to charge it, and that should help headroom, and so that the model will be able to capture that because of the netting.
Maybe one last thing to say about this, again, is we will, in solution development, be looking for the most cost-effective solutions to any deliverability issues. So if storage is the most cost-effective solution, you know, as we move through stage 3 and stage 4, that's what would be proposed to address those needs. It would be storage. Now, again, we believe that the storage would have to be somewhat closely located around where the renewable generation is siting. But as long as we believe that we could execute on that, you know, keep storage and renewables in the same area of the same part of the local pocket, then that would be a viable solution in stage 3 and stage 4 is storage.
Thanks, Jeff. Anna?
Hi, my name is Anna Summer. I'm from Energy Futures Group, and I'm here on behalf of WEACT. This is my first EPPAC meeting, so I'm sure I'm much farther behind on all of this than all of you are. The discussion just prompted a question for me, though, which is that is the model allowed to choose hybrid projects so that you have solar and storage, for example, at the same POI, or does it have to pick storage independently of any renewable generation?
Sarah, this might be a question for the NISO. I mean, I think effectively the capacity expansion model is selecting all these resources somewhat separately. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. There's not a unique specific configuration for a hybrid resource, for instance.
Is that possible to add to the optimization options?
The ability in the software is there, yes. There'd be, I think, a lot of considerations around what the cost would be and exactly what those, constraints should be if you were to do a hybrid resource. So that is not currently implemented. And again, we do have different renewable options and then some other candidate options, but they're all independent resources.
And there's nothing to say that you, in the physical real world, that there might not be advantages to building those combined projects. When we say that there's 1,000 megawatts of renewable solar and 500 megawatts of storage, a chunk of that could be co-located. We're not ruling that out.
Yeah, maybe I'm misunderstanding though that it sounds like based on the headroom discussion that if that becomes a constraint, that it would be advantageous to have that in the model. Am I totally misunderstanding the discussion?
So if we see a constraint as we move through, stages 3 and 4 of CGPP, we'll be coming up with solutions to those constraints. So the solution will probably have to be standalone. I think it will have to be like a standalone solution. So we would identify wires or non-wires alternative like storage or advanced technology, whatever the solution is that makes the most sense for the problem that's being encountered would be what's proposed. It would be a standalone solution. I don't think there's really any opportunity to propose a combined project.
Okay, and so the way you identify whether there's a problem or not is based on whether that headroom limit is reached or not for the zone. Okay.
Well, so headroom is a kind of a proxy that we're using in stage 1. Headroom is meant to help us understand where the best placement of generation is on a zonal level across New York State, like the type of generation, what type of resource and where that resource is located, just on a big zonal kind of idea. As we move through stages 3 and 4 of CGPP, we're going to be drilling down to very specific, like nodal assumptions.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay. This is Raya Salter. I've got a question. Could I jump in with my question now?
Oh. Raya, sorry, I just wanted to add something to Anna's question. I had my hand up for that. Do you mind if I do that before you jump in?
Go ahead. Sorry.
No worries. This is John Berger with NYSERDA. Just following up on the co-located, solar and storage discussion. To really have that incorporated in the capacity expansion model, you would need to have it in the supply curve itself, which it is not. So I think what you're hearing from Skylar and Jeff is for this current analysis, how we're able to think through some of those challenges. But if there were a desire for future work or future rounds of CGPP to think about it differently, you would need to have that as a separately developed input going into the stage 1 capacity expansion itself.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, John. Part of my question, I think, comes from just not knowing what's in the model. So that's helpful to understand. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Go ahead, Ryan.
All right, thank you so much. If you could you maybe I heard you talking about the the lease cost. If you could clarify for me how any any subsidies, state and federal, or other type of or any type of capital um, is factored in there. And the reason I'm asking is just, well, going back to Rev, but also for many years, there's this, understanding that there may be some projects that, may not be economic, but that need to be prioritized, in disadvantaged communities or otherwise. And so I'm trying to see how that may be reflected. And it's another reason why we were interested in the energy communities sort of being tracked as well.
Hmm.
If or,
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. The capacity expansion model does not have any like individual adders or anything like that for specific projects. I know we had put on as one of the metrics we're interested in tracking is when we get down to more of a nodal analysis in the later stages of the CGPP, maybe sometime next year, we'll be able to track what type of the county level build outs or specific nodal information is happening in designated energy communities or in New York State designated DACs.
Right.
But in the capacity expansion model, we don't really have that level of information, so we didn't proactively put in a cost or benefit.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I think I'm getting a bad connection, so I'll go on pause. But I think I heard the beginning of what you were saying, Skylar. Sorry, my
Okay.
connection's.
Oh, no, it's fine. Okay. Just continuing here with the questions, there was another question about just the model's brain, basically, how the model is going to be making decisions with, for example, a headroom number, because we are having zonal headroom, but county level supply curve, and just wanting to know more about the mechanics there. So just to talk through a quick example, and Jay, you and the NISO can jump in if I get anything wrong, but what we're loading a model with is kind of a zonal amount of megawatts that can be basically injected during a given hour. We're also loading it with the cost of various resources, and the resources are based on that supply curve stack. And we've input it in a county level basis so we can track which resources are being selected, but the model itself just sees kind of a hierarchy of costs for that zone. And so the model will be picking based on the load forecast that it sees in there, different resources to meet that load forecast based on the cost that it sees. And then when it reaches a certain level of meeting those needs, it may come up against headroom constraints within that zone where it can't meet any more load with cheap just base renewables in that zone, and then we'll have to make a decision around paying the extra marginal transmission upgrade cost to enable an additional interconnection of renewables, or trying to do something else to meet that load. So there's a number of permutations that the model is going to go through, but that's kind of the process where it sees the cost for building new renewables, but it also sees the cost of building out additional intra-zone transmission capability to enable more renewables in that zone specifically, as opposed to potentially building outside of the zone, to maybe import from other zones to meet that load. So it's that type of decision. Hopefully that clarifies things.
Hey, it's Liz. Raya, is your hand up because you have another question, or is that a legacy hand?
Legacy hand, sorry.
Okay. And I think the last question on this, and maybe there's more questions after this, but the last question we received was on basically tracking the headroom estimates. Is there the chance, and maybe this is a Sarah question, is there a chance where we could have some readout of the model where and like in what years and how much additional headroom was purchased in the model, so we can kind of track that. And this kind of goes back to what Jeff was saying earlier about going back through in future phases of the model. If you can identify those things, when you get to a more nodal analysis, you'll have to figure out what that solution was, or how much was selected in a given region to enable new build outs. Is that something we can track throughout the different scenarios?
This is Sarah from the NISO again. Yes, that is something we can track, and it's my understanding that that is intended to be reported out for each of the scenarios. So, you know, just information on the headroom, and then if headroom is increased.
Got it. Bill?
Skylar, just given your, thanks for the little description of the capacity expansion model there. It raised a thought, a question. You know, we're going to be doing a number of different scenarios, and obviously, the one thing we're sure of here is that we aren't going to predict the future. And so we know we want to do all these scenarios because we know we're not going to get all this right, and the future is going to be different from what we think. What is the thinking around the precision on the scenario, on the zonal choices for the build outs? Are we putting any hedge or any buffer into our thinking here, or are we going to do exactly what the model says? And then I guess the subsequent question to that, which I think is what we're doing, subsequent question to that is, should we be thinking, and maybe this is for round 2 or not round 1, but should we be thinking about any probabilistic thought process on the fact that, you know, if we project, you know, certain zonal build outs that, you know, they might be within 10 or 20% of reality, but they're probably not going to be reality. So, you know, how we might think about that as we model going forward. And again, I understand that might be the next wave of this whole thing, but I'm curious to get the JUs and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Anybody want to take that one?
You know, I guess I'm not really sure how to respond, but maybe just an initial thought, you know, like how practically would we do this, right? Again, remember that whatever we get out of these capacity expansion models, we're going to turn into nodal power flow models. We're already building a very large number of cases. Building even more power flow cases is probably just not something we could achieve. I mean, the only thing I could think of is if you thought the margin was plus or minus 10%, you could overbuild the system by 10%. But, you know, of course, the risk there is that you're going to identify more needs on the system than you would have otherwise because you've added more renewables than you probably need.
This might be one that we don't answer for the first cycle of CGPP, but we put it in the kind of to study and figure out how we think about addressing it in the second cycle. I agree, Jeff. It's not a simple solution as in my eyes either. So.
Yeah, so that is kind of the issue. We don't have much else to really go on. I mean, we have reasonable guesses, but when we're talking about, you know, trying to flow different scenarios through the capacity expansion modeling in stage 1 and then the more granular modeling in the future stages, that is one of the reasons we wanted to have at least, you know, these 3 scenarios that we're building, so that we do have kind of bookends, so that even though we are, like you said, you know, picking up information out of this not very granular model, capacity expansion wise, and dropping it in more localized models, just one for one basically, and trying to figure it out based on literally just what we get out of the model. We're at least doing it with, you know, 3 separate scenarios so that we can actually, you know, have some amount of bookending. I know there's a lot of space between the scenarios based on where the quote unquote correct future might be. There's a pretty big gaps between some of those scenarios, but we're going to have to be, comfortable with a little bit of that uncertainty in this first round, like you mentioned. And maybe this is something we can talk about in future cycles, like how do we manage the potential uncertainty of, results that might be between those different, base, main 3 capacity expansion runs, and how we can maybe flow through to get even better, more granular results throughout the rest of the CGPP. But I think we're going to be tight on time to get this in 2.5 or 3 years right now. And we're trying to just do exactly the same thing we're doing now and trying to figure out how to do it in 2 years. And that's a filing that's due, I think, in about a little less than 4 months. So anything that we have to add, we're mostly looking for things that don't add too much extra work or none, and increase efficiency or improve results or something like that. So if we can figure out a way to show that this is definitely going to improve results, or the way we're currently doing it is going to miss, something or other. Definitely always open to hearing those, and also how we might be able to speed different, portions of this process up.
That makes sense to me, Skylar. And I guess just a request. It seems that it would be helpful if we had a more formal process, or you guys at DPS formally kept track of the areas, the items that we want to address in the next cycle of coordinated group planning process. And when I say want to address it, it may not be that we do address them, but things that the EPPAC has raised that are worthy of conversation going into the next cycle. And this I would put as one of the ones that you put on that list.
That's a great point, Bill. And we are tracking a list of things that have come up either internally with us or have been brought to our attention by the JU or stakeholders. Kind of that list of potential either improvements or changes to the process. Because in addition to that, speeding things up filing that's due in June, we also have a filing from staff that's due on June 1st, covering how things have gone so far and potential updates to the process for future cycles. So that is something that's going to have to be on probably an EPPAC call at some point between now and, say, May, so we can make sure that in addition to whatever we've heard and taken notes on during these meetings, there's a dedicated meeting where everybody can come prepared to talk about specific things that they want, they think could be changed or updated as part of this process. So that's a good note.
Thanks.
And Chi, I see your hand up. Is it changing a topic? Because I also saw Anna's hand come up right after I said something, so I wasn't sure if that was a continuation of the topic.
Just some thought to share. So Skylar, very much to your point, that's the reason why we analyze different scenarios to see what are some of the commonalities between the different system conditions. I think this is a pretty common planning practice, and then I personally support it completely. And Bill, you're asking about precision, and this is especially in the planning world, even in the operational world, there needs to be some of the buffer built in. And it is actually extremely difficult to predict what kind of precision this analysis or any planning process might have. Just take forecast, for example. The forecast, even the day ahead, or you could sometimes get 1,000 megawatt of mismatch, let alone we're talking about 20, 30 years going forward. But saying that does not mean I don't have any confidence in forecast, quite the contrary. I'm just using that as an example of how much low forecast, which is the foundation of any planning analysis, could dictate the outcome. So one of the thought I'm having, just I don't know if it's possible for this round, is rather than identifying how precise it can be, and Skylar, like I agree with you, I don't really think we can do, maybe prioritization might be a different approach. To say if something is if a facility is overloaded by 100% versus a facility that is overloaded by 5%, then perhaps that one is overloaded by the 100% has And based on the flow pattern, based on how common it is across different year, different scenario, then maybe that one is a higher priority rather than the 5% that only showed up in one of the cases. So I don't have an answer to about the precision, but I think we could try to prioritize the violation we need to resolve and also the solution that might need according to it. And this is brainstorming. So feel free to agree or disagree with my thoughts. Thanks.
Skylar, could I respond to that real quick?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I know we've got hands, but I appreciate that, Yashi, and I think because you used the word precision, I wanted to be very clear on what I was asking, because I certainly was not really asking about the precision of the forecast. My view here is that we're intentionally doing multiple forecasts, multiple scenarios, because we understand that none of these is going to be a precise view of the future world. Where I was going with it is that we are doing somewhat of a probabilistic analysis on other dimensions, and should we be doing somewhat of a probabilistic analysis on the zonal distributions also? And I realize that's a bridge too far for phase one here, but I think it might not be a bridge too far for the next round of the coordinated grid planning process. But the reason why I care a lot about this is that the solutions we choose may be very different if we're looking at a range of probabilities as opposed to locking in on certain prioritized probabilities. And so, we can have solutions that work very well for one or two things and work terribly for options 3, 4, 5. And we really need to very carefully look at how that probabilistic analysis is factored into our solution set. And I realize that's for the later stage of this process, but I do think that this is obviously a key challenge with any sort of forecasting of the future. But it's going to be a really important challenge here given the degree of uncertainty. So I really appreciate your point on the fact that we're not going to have precision here, and we really do need to think about how we handle that.
Thanks, Bill. I'm taking notes, but also bring all that stuff to that dedicated meeting we want to have on on these topics. Because you're right that we don't know how good we can get. 2 years from now or 3 years from now, we might be able to make some significant improvements. Okay, sorry, Anna, go ahead.
Thanks, Skylar. Let me know if this question is better addressed offline. Maybe the others know the answer to this, but something Jeff said about constructing nodal power flow cases kind of triggered this question for me. If that's the step at which the non-wires alternatives are being considered, how does that kind of relate back to the purpose of the capacity expansion step, which my understanding was to identify whether there are transmission improvements that would need to be made across all three scenarios? Is that I imagine that the nodal power flow cases aren't looking at all 8760 hours, that you'd have to choose some stress events like early morning in the winter time, for example. And obviously power flow models aren't economic models either. Can you talk more about how you would decide whether those non-wires alternatives could avoid the transmission investments that are identified in the capacity expansion stuff?
Jeff, did you want to take that one? I think you might be better to answer that. I can just take a quick overview, but in the capacity expansion, you're right. We're doing that capacity expansion modeling to see if there are both intra or interzonal build outs in this economic long-term planning forecast. If there's constraints that arise and there's binding constraints between zones or within zones where we likely need additional build out, when we turn that model information over to the utilities to build out their nodal modeling and run those power flows, they're not kind of redoing all of that to figure out the issues. They're kind of trying to do their best to place all that information from that stage 1 model, the capacity expansion, into their nodal power flows to test specifically when those, issues that were kind of hinted at in the capacity expansion modeling, when and where specifically those actually happen. And maybe there's additional ones that we didn't see in the capacity expansion modeling. And taking all that information into account, there might be some wiggling they have to do with the resources. Putting them in different areas might be way cheaper, or putting a non-wires alternative in, or doing something else like a traditional transmission solution. Maybe there's a specific one-to-one mapping where it's as simple as it sounds, and it's just one transmission upgrade was required to allow a facility to get built and meet load in the zone as an economic resource. But a lot of that is going to be within that stage 2 and stage 3 modeling, and specific results will flow out of that. We're not getting like specific results out of the capacity expansion model. We'll have to wait till the stage 2 and 3 there. But we are tracking the quantity of headroom or new transmission capacity that is being chosen in the capacity expansion model. So we at least have a gut check of that in stage 1, and then we'll have a lot more granular information in future stages. But this is one of the reasons why a lot of folks really want to start talking about the siting methodology of how that translation actually happens. Bringing the capacity expansion modeling information into stage 2 is because that's where we're really going to find out the specific needs, the specific upgrades. And Jeff, you can correct anything I just said.
No, I think you got it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
And there's also that separate process. If there are hints in the modeling, once we get preliminary results, if there's hints in the modeling that the model is constrained between zones, or there's other upgrades happening at utility interfaces or something like that, there is the chance for us to start looking at bulk solutions as well, and that would happen on a parallel path outside of the the normal stage 2 and 3 and 4 modeling. Okay, well, we're at the end of the list of questions that has been sent in over the last few weeks. As always, please feel free to keep sending those questions. It's very important that we do address any of these things. You might catch something that we need to discuss. So keep sending those in. Always happy to do that. And as I mentioned, our next meeting is not going to be until the 26th because of President's Day. And hopefully by that time we will have both the spreadsheet of the new scenarios and some of those data sets, along with the matrices that show the final 3 scenarios that we're moving forward with. That will be posted online. We'll also send that out via email. And happy to discuss anything offline as well, or via email. So if there's nothing else, maybe I'll give it another 10-second count on the call today, but we're getting close to adjourning. So if anybody else has anything, now's the time.
Hey, Skylar, it's Liz. I just want to put in my usual thank you to everybody for making the time and following along in this discussion.
Thanks, Liz. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining, folks, and thanks for all the great questions. And we will see you in 3 weeks. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.